Want to welcome our panelists here today. Thank you. And a little trivia, they're fraternity brothers from Wesleyan. I just haven't figured out who hazed who.
Who hazed me?
Okay. All right. So you're the younger.
I'm the younger.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. As most of you know, the panel has traveled around the country over the past few months to hold roundtable discussions with companies that are trying to do business with the Department of Defense. No matter where we went or what sector of the industrial base we met with, we heard time and again that red tape and bureaucracy are getting in the way of innovation, efficiency, and jobs. In Rock Island, Illinois, we heard complaints that export controls are overly restrictive. Many of the businesses we spoke to highlighted that we currently take a one-size-fits-all approach to determining what is placed on the U.S. munitions list. There is no mechanism for items to smartly be moved off that list as technology advances and specific items become readily available on the global market. In Santa Clarita, California, we heard from a gentleman who owned a company that was last audited by the Defense Contracting Audit Agency in 2005, and the audit was still open due to failures on the part of DCAA. He estimated that having his open audit on the books has cost his company $3 to $4 million in lost business over the last 6 years. In Akron, Ohio, we heard that although programs like the Small Business Innovative Research Program aid in technology development, the technology rarely goes anywhere because there is no mechanism to assist in completing the stringent military test requirements, nor is there resourcing to get the technology into production. In Honolulu, we met with a small business owner who commented that small businesses are simply not equipped to deal with the bureaucracy of DOD acquisition system. In San Diego, California, we heard from a businessman who felt that the large primes don't want small business to innovate, and another who commented that anyone that wants to partner with a small business simply wants your technology. Both these gentlemen agreed that more needs to be done to protect the intellectual property of small businesses. Here's the thing. It isn't just one guy in Ohio or a CEO in California or a small business owner in Illinois. These issues were consistently raised everywhere we went, from the shipyard workers in Hawaii to the nanotechnology developers in Ohio. We invited 3 witnesses to be with us today to explore those issues and provide us with recommendations to eliminate some of the red tape. Unfortunately, one of our witnesses, Mr. Raj Sarma, president of the FAIR Institute, needed a few more days to recover from surgery he had last week and will not be able to join us. He did provide us with written testimony and is standing by to respond to any questions we may have for him following the hearing. We wish him a speedy recovery and ask his written statement be entered into the record. Today with us are Dr. Alan Berman, President of the Jefferson Solutions, and Mr. Joel Johnson, former Vice President of the Aerospace Industries Association of America. Both of these gentlemen brings a unique set of experience and expertise to the table. I hope that we'll have a fruitful exchange today, and you will be able to assist this panel in formulating recommendations to improve the business environment out there. And with that, I'll yield to Mr. Larson if he has an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Schuster, and I'm pleased to be joining you and the other panel members today in what is the last hearing of the panel's first 6 months.
Is it?
Looking at the staff is confirming that it is in fact our last hearing of the panel's first 6 months to look at the challenges of doing business with the Department of Defense. Since this panel kicked off, we've heard from countless large and small defense contractors, DOD officials, noted academics, and nonprofit and think tanks about doing business with the Department. While each individual had their own take on doing business with DOD, many common themes emerged. The federal acquisition process consists of many onerous rules and regulations. There's not enough communication between industry and the government buyer. The technology valley of death continues to grow. The accounting and auditing standards used by DOD agencies are antiquated and don't differentiate between large and small companies. There's a lack of skilled acquisition professionals, and government export control policies hinder the sale of U.S. goods and services to foreign buyers. Today's hearing focuses on some of the most complex issues that negatively impact small business' ability to become and remain viable partners to the Department: contracting and procurement processes, as well as regulatory policies. While U.S. goods and services and the process in which the DOD buys them has repeatedly proven to be world-class, it's not without limitations. For many companies doing business with the DOD, either the cost to enter the defense market or the cost to comply with defense regulations is prohibitive. This panel would benefit from hearing recommendations from our witnesses that might lead to DOD's contracting system becoming more flexible, allowing more entrants into the defense market. We'd also like to hear your recommendations for ideas to bolster the existing defense industrial base while taking steps towards creating a 21st century defense industrial base that's more diverse, more agile, and more able to respond to an array of potential threats. Shifting to a more agile 21st century defense industrial base will mean making difficult choices about what we want our defense industrial base to look like and what goods and services we want it to provide. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for appearing before the panel this afternoon and ask that they offer the panel their expert viewpoints on what they feel are some necessary steps needed to create a more flexible acquisition process. I'm also interested in hearing about what steps DOD and industry can take to increase communication and transparency, not just at the top leadership levels, but trickling down to the buying commands and program officers. Last, I'm interested in hearing what our witnesses believe are the most significant challenges that DOD faces in buying goods and services, and briefly offer your thoughts on at least one significant barrier faced by the industry to remain a viable defense partner. For example, I can't help but recall a couple of export control challenges that were presented to the panel while we were conducting a roundtable discussion in Chairman McKeon's district a few weeks ago. When small business noted that on a particular contract to provide air conditioners for a weapons platform, that the basic air conditioner was required to be ITAR compliant simply because DOD wanted it to be painted similar to the platform it supported. Another participant who manufactures lithium-ion batteries described how unnecessary ITAR restrictions impacts his, quote, competitiveness not only in exporting, but also how it impacted his domestic sales as well, unquote. These are tough issues that fall largely outside the jurisdiction of this committee, but nonetheless should be addressed if we as a nation seek to help our industrial base, particularly our small businesses, remain vital to defense and to our economy. So I want to thank Dr. Berman and Mr. Johnson for their participation this afternoon. I look forward to hearing from each of you. And again, thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And as well, Mr. Chairman, it looks like we, in fact, will have Representative Hanabusa's presence at this hearing, maintaining her stellar attendance.
Thank goodness.
Record.
I wouldn't know what to do if she wasn't here. Welcome to all. We have a full house here today, so welcome all the members to the hearing today. And with that, Dr. Berman, if you'd proceed with your testimony. Your microphone, sir. Your microphone. You have to press the button.
Now, do you hear me? Sorry. And members of the committee, I'm Alan Berman, President of Jefferson Solutions, a woman-owned small business and chairman of the Procurement Roundtable. I'm also a former administrator for federal procurement policy of the United States and served in that post under Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Clinton. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on challenges facing companies doing business with the Department of Defense, and I'd ask that my statement be submitted for the record, and I will summarize its main points. Jefferson has done many acquisition reviews across the government, and the same issues tend to come up again and again. Contracting offices are often overworked and under-equipped. Collaboration between program and contract staff is poor, and there's a lot of confusion on what government can say to industry and when. Some of these problems come from the mismatched growth of dollars and staff. If you look at DOD's contract obligations, from fiscal year 1999 to fiscal year 2010, they went from $165 billion to $366 billion, an increase of 122%. However, if you take a look at staffing over that same time frame, contract staffing, you're seeing a growth of about 20%. The fix to a lot of these kinds of problems tends to be additional layers of policy and regulation. And what ends up is added complexity, burden, and cost particularly for small businesses. I think the committee recognizes, and those who are in this profession looking at acquisition, the acquisition community, agree that we need to strike some kind of balance between workload and staffing, efficiency and risk, and regulation and cost. Today I'd like to speak to four major topics of concern and challenges: communications between government and industry, the imbalance between federal contracting workload and staffing, the risks involved with the improper use of lowest price, technically acceptable contracting techniques, and the cost of increasing use of regulation. With regard to communications, as I mentioned, there seems to be a lot of confusion and misinformation on the level and timing of communication between government and industry, and people are hesitant to talk. Dan Gordon, as procurement administrator, the most recent administrator, just recently resigned, came up with a Mythbusters top 10 list. And here are some things to do. When requests for information go out, government should follow up with meetings to perform market research. One-on-one meetings help both sides in understanding capabilities and needs. And debriefs should be as thorough as possible to help small businesses better compete and to reduce protests. When we first started, when Solutions started in the mid-90s, we went through a lot of procurements where it definitely helped us to come in and find what we'd done wrong to be able to correct those kinds of things. We ended up doing a lot better as a result. So more communication and more understanding of how the other side operates, I think, is a great benefit for both. With regard to staffing, we find overworked and understaffed personnel. They don't have the time to get the training, development, and refreshers they need. You see low morale and high turnover. Procurements are delayed and customer service suffers, and staff are not developing the competencies they need. As a result of this, agencies are looking to using less complicated evaluation schemes inappropriately, such as lowest price technically acceptable ones, as a way to sidestep the inability of staff to perform a best value analysis effectively. Even with reduced budgets, and we see this coming, the agency must invest in the necessary support, training, and staffing of its workforce. Now, I mentioned lowest price technically acceptable and the risks associated with it. This really is a focus on price, and it results in big risks for the department because it drives innovation off the table. Competitors only show enough qualification to get by. Evaluations start at prices, and if the low-cost offer is technically acceptable, then they win, and no one else's proposal can be even seen or is even seen. So small businesses that can't offer incredibly low bids are forced out of the process. I know this is an issue that has already been raised before this committee. The end result is government gets unrealistically low bids and firms can't do the work. Jack Answer, a former Undersecretary of Defense, cited this as something that the NRO was using as a contracting technique, and for buying security services, he called it a failure waiting to happen. I see the same thing happening now with the Navy going down the path for its highly sophisticated multi-billion-dollar next-generation enterprise network contract. By essentially denying the best products, services, and ideas, LPTA sends a message that subpar work is good enough for government. With regard to small business goals, I know the department is behind on its goals, missed some of its goals in 2010. There's a common complaint that the agency tends to favor large businesses. This isn't a new complaint. When I was procurement administrator, I had to arbitrate between the SBA and the department to get the department to raise its goals. And for a department with large, sophisticated procurements, it's hard to hit these numbers. Certain categories of activities that lend themselves to small business participation, like construction or base repair work, they tend to bear the brunt. And larger businesses in these fields then see themselves as being treated unfairly. The goals will not be met without the strongest possible leadership in the department. I know that Secretary Panetta has mentioned this a number of times. It is a key issue for him. Then the increased tendency toward regulation. This creates the same types of costs and process delays that the regulations are meant to remedy. For example, the Department of Labor's final rule on non-displacement of qualified workers under service contracts ends up creating new hurdles for getting rid of poor-performing incumbent contractors, even after the company employing them loses the work. The most comprehensive assessment of this regulatory constraints is a 1994 Coopers and Lybrand study for Bill Perry. It was a major effort, 1,000 interviews. They came up with a result of 18% cost differential for firms doing business with DOD. Maybe it's time to look at this again, and maybe time to redo this study. I hope the points that I've raised have been helpful to the committee. I strongly support the work of this committee to address the issues that make it hard for firms to do business and to provide meaningful support to the department. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, and committee members, this concludes my prepared remarks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions you or other committee's members may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berman. And with that, Mr. Johnson, if you would proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the panel. I, too, am pleased to be here. I'm testifying on my own behalf, although, as you noticed, I'm unsuccessfully retired from 20 years in the trade association world and a few more years in the government, including 3 years on the other body across the way here. I was particularly interested in reading the summaries of your industry roundtables. My experience when I was at AIA was certainly that you never were in doubt as to what the large primes wanted. They made sure you knew, but for small guys, you really needed to go out to them because they weren't set up in Washington to express what their concerns were, and they didn't particularly want to necessarily express them in front of primes or DOD. So you had to go to them. I think this is going to be a very challenging time for the small guys. as the procurement budget shrinks, not only does the procurement budget shrink, but the primes pull work in-house. So it's double jeopardy for the small guys. And that means that people who aren't in the defense arena are going to be even more hesitant to get into it when they look at the newspapers. So we need to work to get them involved. The big thing about small companies is they're small. They don't have contracting and accounting experience or capabilities that the big guys have. In the private world, they basically focus on inventing and manufacturing and marketing their product for a price. They don't deal in a world where contracting, accounting, and even lobbying are comparative advantages, which they are in the world we deal here in Washington. They're also handicapped by the fact that it's probably easier for DOD to deal with a prime than it is with those guys, and that means the primes have the capacity. The primes can better able to search out capability and to use commercial market prices to buy stuff. On the other hand, this risks the small companies losing their technology to the primes, and of course, the primes are going to take a percentage as they work with DOD. So, bottom line, if DOD is going to directly seek out and take advantage of innovation that may be in the small business sector, it has to go out of its way to do so. There are several suggestions I would have, most of which you're familiar with. Use FAR Part 12 commercial contracting where you can. Raise the threshold for TINA maybe to $1 million, possibly $2 million. Make sure that now that you've extended SBIR and STTR programs that they're funded, assure small companies they won't have their intellectual property hijacked either by DOD or the primes. Develop good outreach programs so that the small guys actually know what's available to them and the DOD really honest engine is interested to them. Finally, because I spent much of my professional career tilting at export controls, I noted the subject consistently came up in your roundtables, and both of you have mentioned it this morning. I'd be happy to discuss. If there's anything more mysterious than FAR and DFARS, it's ITAR. And if there's anything that small companies know less about than FAR and DFAR, it's ITAR. And if there's a valley of death, this is the kiss of death very often. If you want to get into the export world, or even in terms of what you have to do on your own shop floor in protecting your technology from your own engineer, for example, who happens to be Indian-born and on an H-2 visa. In any case, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. And with that, we'll open up for questions. I'm going to start, change it up here a little bit, start down with Mr. West for first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also Mr. Ranking Member, and thanks for the panel for being here today. I think one of the things that are really causing us to bust budgets in the military is the acquisition process and system, especially weapon system development. I mean, 10, 15, 20 years. So when I read and I look at, we have the Weapon Systems Acquisition Reform Act of 2009. I'd like to get an assessment from you two gentlemen. How do you see this act in its early stages? Have we seen any changes moving toward a betterment and a streamlining of this acquisition process?
I think clearly the act is meant to try to improve how these major systems are acquired, but frankly I think it's too early to really get any sense with new systems to see whether things have really improved. So I'd say it's a wait and see kind of an effort. I think the policies are in place to try to improve the process, but I don't think we see much at this point.
I couldn't disagree with that, or let's put it this way. I would agree with that. The policies are just getting underway. I think some of the basic notions are, do the 80, 85, 90% solutions, but don't push the state of the art to the point where you wind up procuring forever but not getting a product at the end of the day, which has been an Army problem, obviously, over the last few years.
Yeah, I know that well.
That you design for the absolute best and ultimately don't wind up with a product.
So my question then is, when is the first maybe evaluation point that you all would recommend? I mean, I don't want to see us, go 5, 6, or 7 years down the road and no one asks a question about, okay, have we seen anything? I mean, is there some type of, measuring of effectiveness that we have at a 2-year, 3-year point?
I don't think anything has been set up in terms of doing that. My recommendation would be to have a GAO investigation, a GAO report and review, but wait 3 or 4 years, pick the systems that you want to look at and see what's been going on in terms of dealing with this question of are you asking for everything, or are you actually trying to deal with these issues? I know the same complaint has been made about the new fighter plane in terms of how long that's gone through an acquisition process. I mean, people are talking 30 years or so in terms of the time frame. It's sort of incredible. And then when you think about the technology development that occurs in an 18-month time frame, you can see why dealing with the integration issues and the other kinds of issues, it becomes almost an impossible job to get that resolved and to bring anything in under price, you know, and on schedule, given these kinds of problems. So I'd say that would be the suggestion I'd recommend, and clearly the GAO is well accustomed to doing those kinds of reviews.
I think I would add, at risk of offending some of my former employers, but there is a problem when the colonel or the general says, I want to do this, the contractor says, yes, sir. No one asks, what will it cost and is it worth it? And you add on, you add on, you add on. That's what happened to the president's helicopter. I mean, you started out with a perfectly serviceable helicopter that had 100,000 hours of combat experience, and first the Navy wanted to do it the Navy way, and so you start dismantling a helicopter that's supposed to be off the shelf, and then you keep adding electronics, and everybody says, yes, sir, we can do that. And you wind up with Air Force One with a rotor. And somehow the system somewhere, whether it be in the Pentagon or even on the Hills, has to say, well, what does that cost and what percentage improvement is it going to give me? And somehow that doesn't happen.
Next question. Last week I sat down with Brigadier General Aviali, who is the Israeli one-star general, head of their Israeli Defense Export and Cooperation Department. Question, can we do a better job, you think, when it comes to our acquisition process of working with our allies to, look at how we can have common operating systems and maybe getting more commercial off-the-shelf technology instead of going through these long, exorbitant procurement processes that we have here in America?
Well, now you're starting to get into the old ITAR issue, among other things. That's very difficult to talk to some of our allies, even our closest allies, at least at the company level, as to what do you do, what do I do? And we played around with these notions of different kinds of licenses, which by and large state has never been terribly enthused about. We had if you go all the way back to Clinton Bush, the so-called DITSI initiatives, they were set up an issue. One, they were going to issue a program license for, say, 2 companies could get together and brainstorm. And if they came up with something, then, okay, you come back and get a license, but at least let the engineers talk to each other about what each of them could do. It was used once for a Raytheon Thales program at the big think level. It's never been used again. Somehow we need to find ways. I know engineers always talk too much and they all want to solve the problem, but that's the only way 2 companies can find out what they know. They don't know what they don't know until they talk about it. And again, this is an area where I think we could be much more imaginative in how we worked export controls, especially at the pre-think level.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Was there a reason why they never used it again, or just did it and said, enough of that?
I think basically state never liked the whole idea. There were several approaches to this, and basically you had to trust people to work within parameters, and the system would much rather define very carefully exactly what you can and can't do. Well, the problem is you don't know what that is until you've had a chance to talk. And talk about that a little. I'll give you an anecdote later if we're still on ITAR.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be. With that, Mr. Larson.
Well, don't let me stop you. Let's get on with ITAR. I know that there's been legislation introduced in Congress to look at the export control policies of the government, and effort started under Secretary Gates and continued under Mr. Panetta, along with the other relevant departments, to rework the munitions list. What specific reforms do you think would be most helpful that this panel should be promoting with regards to export control and ITAR?
Well, I realize it's not your jurisdiction, but as I point out in my testimony, most export control legislation in the last 10 years has been done in armed services bills, not it goes back to SFRC. Sometimes have problems getting their bills done and out. One thing one might want to look at, for example, is 250. DOD has chaired all of the interagency review panels to argue, try to figure out what do we want to keep on the munitions list and what can go over to the commerce list that's easier, less interest, which has never been done before. I mean, people think of the munitions list as if there's actually a list there. I mean, it's a list of tanks and guns, and then down below it says, and anything designed or modified for anything above is on the munitions list. So this is what kills the small guy. He's got a machine shop. In theory, if he's ever worked for a defense contractor, he should be registered with the State Department at 27 to get $17.50 the first year and X amount, even if he's never exported. The law says he should be registered. Most of them, of course, aren't because they never heard of the ITAR. One of the things at a minimum that was done is DOD ultimately identified a bunch of stuff they thought, we don't care at all about this stuff. Just radiator hoses, hydraulic hoses, engine mounts, with all due deference, in the Air Force, pittle bags. I mean, all of these are on the munitions list. And they said, no. This is commercial stuff. We don't care. It's been identified. Someone should ask the administration, at least send that, do their 38F notification to Congress and see what Congress does. Congress will probably say, fine, put it over here, and when it's over here, we're not worrying about it. A whole lot of small companies suddenly then are completely free of this business. They don't know anything about ITAR. They'll never have to know about ITAR because what they're building isn't that kind of stuff. And that's not the kind of stuff you're terribly interested in, but at least it would solve an immediate problem. Mm-hmm. It may be that one might want to look at legislation that would say, when you're exploring a technology with a small company, maybe DOD decides up front whether this is something they want to control as a military item or not. And I go back to one of my first field trips 25 years ago, and nothing's changed. I was at a university, and the Army was putting some money into a program where this is all, of course, pre-NUCs and pre-all kinds of things. This is 30 years ago. They wanted a flexible display sheet, something like a piece of paper that you could fold up, but when you got to a table, you could open it up, plug it into your computer, and out would be a whole map. I mean, and the Army was so afraid of getting this stuff caught up in the ITAR that they didn't dare talk to the people they were giving the money to as to what they wanted. They had to go circuitously because as soon as it was built to a military spec, it became an ITAR item. And the Army knew that if it had been an ITAR item, they could never afford it. They had to get it out in the commercial world. That's what they wanted to do, make gazillions of them, and we'll ruggedize it, and that can be on the ITAR, but don't get the immediate technology on ITAR, or this company's never going to have a market. And so that might be one thing one could look at is when you start putting money into a technology, decide up front whether you'd like to see this commercialized or not, and then we'll pick the cherry off the tree when it does. And now I can afford it. Because in the electronics world, the stuff that's most affordable is the stuff that you can buy at Best Buy, and then you can ruggedize it. But don't start out with it as a military item up front, or you're in this morass. It's not the valley of death. Again, it's the kiss of death. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of thoughts.
Yeah. Dr. Berman, do you have some thoughts on this?
No, I would say the same thing, and it's very analogous to the kinds of issues that we were dealing with on the acquisition front. Back in the early 90s, just trying to get someone to move away from putting specifications, military specifications on everything was just a tremendous problem, and you couldn't get people to want to participate because of all of these kinds of constraints. Ultimately, Bill Perry, Secretary of Defense at the time, put in a requirement that said that people had to justify it if they were going to put military specifications for commercial type items, and we had legislation passed that encouraged people to buy commercially. I mean, one of the problems that I tend to deal with is the community, the acquisition community tends to be a very risk-averse community. And so people even from the Congress would say to me, well, they can do these things. They can buy that stuff. They don't need to do all of that. But when push came to shove, unless there was something there that really gave people an opportunity to see that, yeah, they weren't going to get in trouble by going down that path. They weren't going to do it. And so ultimately we had legislation passed. This committee certainly supported that legislation to try to make it clear that we were looking down this commercial product path and commercial services path and trying to reduce the burdens for people and small businesses doing business with the government. It was a major accomplishment. It was a bipartisan accomplishment, but it took a lot of work to get there.
Yield back.
Mr. Schilling.
Thank you, Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I'm going to start with Mr. Johnson. Your statement also touched on ways for the DOD to reach out into the communities to encourage small businesses to do contracts with the DOD. Are public-private partnerships like those under 4544 with organic industrial bases, are those a good way to bring in the very small businesses and get them used to doing work with the DOD?
Yeah, I mean, anything that gets their feet wet, as long as it doesn't discourage them in the process. I mean, I was also thinking about everything from most states have economic development offices. Can one reach out to those? A number of states like Florida, I'm trying to think of, you usually see at least 7 states trying to attract aerospace at the Paris Air Show and at the Farnborough Air Show. Those are states that obviously are interested in this subject. They must have outreach. Could the military or DOD work with some of these state organizations that are economic development operations, or more specifically aerospace, because of course that's where an awful lot of the technology is. But the little guys don't necessarily, read the Daily Federal Register, or they don't read they don't know what they don't know. So I think you need to find some intermediaries that do know how to touch these folk, not just from Washington, but from again, probably the states are the best instruments, although, I mean, some big cities have these kind of things also, where they do know who's out there and who's looking for money and who's looking for expansion. Some of the another place one might look to, again, are some of the university communities. Obviously, universities know this stuff, but again, they're terrified of both IP and they're terrified of ITAR. I mean, what, 50% of all engineering graduate students are foreign born. So what they don't want to do is, if the touch of the military touches them, suddenly half their students are inaccessible for this work. So, I mean, again, one needs to be a little careful as to when do you militarize and when do you, or what kind of arm's length can you have so you can stir up the animals that you want to stir up, and pick the right time to intervene, as this now becomes an interesting defense issue. Going back to my Army analogy, how do you get this stuff going that you want going, without crossing the line to when now you're doing mil-specs or you're doing a specific military contract? You don't get a little distance between you before you close the door.
Very good. Thank you for that. You mentioned in your statement that the DOD should be able to interact with the private sector in a way the private sector is used to doing business, a more open and interactive forum. How do we restructure, and you kind of answered a little bit of that there with maybe talking with universities, so on and so forth, but how do we restructure DOD acquisitions and procurement offices to address this, or do we need to focus more on changing the culture within the DOD?
Alan's smarter on this than I am, but I'll just come back to the point he talked about. Whether it be in acquisition or in export controls, the incentives are all never make a mistake. The incentives aren't do really great. Find, the golden chalice. The incentives are never make a mistake so I don't get in trouble. And I don't know how you turn that around. I mean, procurement guys in the private companies do get rewarded when they find good technology at good prices. They also may get cashiered if they screw up. But there is there's a rewards incentive, and there's not much of that within the government community. Similar to export controllers have really there's no incentive to make the thing go out, which is why those of us in industry are terrified at the idea of a standalone export control agency. Because I mean, their only incentive is to make sure nothing goes out that shouldn't go out. There's no incentive to say we got to do cooperative programs with our allies, or we have to do cooperative research with our allies. They're saying if I never let anything out, I'll never be in trouble. So, how do you incentivize people to go the other way around? But Alan knows.
I know, and I think you're right. It is a cultural issue, and there are consequences. If you're a procurement person and somehow it looks like you're giving special treatment to somebody, you can get in a lot of trouble. The company can get in a lot of trouble. So the more that you can get information from the leadership of all of these organizations that deal with this to demonstrate that it's in the government's interest and it's in their interest to have this kind of communication. And clearly you have to put in enough constraints so that somebody's not providing sensitive information or proprietary information to someone. But that can be easily worked out. But people have to understand that this is the way the government wants to go, because this is the way that you are going to bring more people into the government marketplace, more companies into the marketplace.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen.
Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What are your thoughts on the Other Transactions Authority as a means to increase opportunities for small businesses?
Well, I think it provides an innovative way to allow companies to be able to participate where there's a lot of flexibility in exactly how do you structure things. So I'd say that this authority, it was actually something that I understood was put in place many years ago with NASA with Paul Demling, who was a member of the Procurement Roundtable, trying to come up with a way to figure out how to invite some issues where you don't really know what the answer is or the approach should be, and offer an opportunity and some flexibility to do that. Anything that offers openness, flexibility, another approach to be able to encourage businesses to come into the government, I think is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What can be done, and certainly you've talked about this some, what can be done to reduce the risk-averse culture in DOD so that contracting officers are more inclined to contract with small businesses?
Yeah, that's that'd be great to have that solution.
I'm counting on you.
I've been plugging away at trying to do that for a long time to again make it clear that the approach is something that is in the best interest of the government and something you're not going to be held accountable for. But the community itself tends to be very risk averse. Frankly, when I was doing that, it needed congressional action to get people to feel that they could do something where many people said you can do it anyway. The rules allow you to do it. So I don't know if you need more emphasis from this body to try to make that point. Clearly, my successor at OFPP, Dan Gordon, who just left to go over to GW, had a major effort to try to get that kind of word out, encourage people to have conversations, better communications. And I think that's clearly a benefit to the government and to the industry, because if both sides know what the other wants, you're going to get a better deal, ultimately. Mm-hmm. But the more, at least the leadership of the organization will back you up on doing these kinds of things, then I think the better chance you have of people being willing to stick their necks out a bit. Mm-hmm. But it's a community that doesn't like to do that.
Mr. Johnson?
Again, maybe you need some appropriate threshold under which you don't have to. I've had these experiences as a consultant personally where DOD said, yeah, I'd like to do this study, but gee, I'd have to competitive bid it for $100,000. I'm not going to do that. It's too much trouble. So go find somebody that has a task order that you can attach yourself to and we'll funnel the money through. And of course 10% goes off the top. Somebody writes 12 checks and they're happy. And I've seen this happen, but maybe there ought to be some authority at some level to say, you have the authority to do this. Now, and similarly on the private sector side, and when I'm back at AIA days, when one of our guys screwed up, you'd say, just please God, don't write another reg. Put him in jail. White-collar workers hate jail. The word gets around. But don't write another reg. I mean, that's when you get FARs and DARs like this. I remember a friend of mine, 4 administrations ago, say, if I only bottle common sense, we'd solve a lot of our problems. But I think you can't wring every possible thing with a regulation. You've got to have some ability for human beings to make some decisions, and occasionally they'll make a wrong one. But as long as they're not doing it because they're lining their own pocket, in which case they should go to jail. There ought to be some flexibility for people, at least at the small level, to to do things that aren't necessarily a competitive bid. The guy has a really bright idea, and yeah, that's worth $100,000 for me to figure out whether it's a really good idea. I mean, how do we do that?
Just another example in that whole area was the use of purchase cards. I mean, purchase cards were a tremendous advantage in terms of reducing some of the burden on contracting people, giving program people more authority. But then all of a sudden people are buying Christmas gifts and Jeeps and other kinds of things, and pretty soon where do the purchase cards go? Well, there's a tremendous savings by getting people to use that as opposed to paper and pencil and having the acquisition community doing that job. So here's a case where you need the balance. You recognize somebody's going to do bad things. You want to do something about those people doing bad things, be able to monitor it, know it, but don't take away the ability for 95, 99% of the people to use a device that we're all very familiar with and that most people are going to use successfully.
Thank you.
Mr. Runyon.
Thank you, Chairman. And I always love the word common sense because we lack a lot of it around here. But just talking about, and really to both of you, how changes in procurement, acquisition, regulations and that, and we see this happen throughout our economy, our tax structure. What are the rules of the game? How much of that are we creating ourselves on a yearly basis?
No, I mean, again, every time one adds another regulation, you're almost guaranteeing somebody's going to foul up because nobody can possibly know all the regulations. And again, there needs to be some way to just have a little bit of human discretion with a little penalty. If you do wrong is not the same as making a mistake. I mean, particularly if you're exploring technologies, you often learn the most from when something blows up, in my world, or it falls down. That's not necessarily somebody doing evil. It's somebody exploring the boundaries of science. If somebody does wrong, then they should be punished. But again, not another batch of regs. And maybe we need more recognition for people in the procurement world when they do something innovative, so that there are some positive upsides. I don't know how much. I know there's a few.
That generally doesn't hit the Washington Post. It's kind of the other side that you read about in the newspapers, unfortunately. So you're not seeing a lot of gold stars for folks. But I agree with Joel that if you can try to do that, that would be a great way to at least try to deal with the cultural issues that Mr. Schilling talked about.
And that's obviously rewarding people for that, and also taking chances. I think a lot of times, like you admit, that's where your cutting edge stuff is going to come from, and we can't be afraid to go out and ask people to take those risks sometimes. And I think and not only there, I think dealing on the small business aspect of it, they're not either fiscally or just even in their heart of hearts, they don't want to go out and take those risks. And I think not only from a regulatory aspect of it, to obviously I use the term all the time. Why are we always changing the rules of the game when we're in the middle of the game? And I think that weighs on the small guy a tremendous lot. So
and there are a lot of rules.
Yes, and I thank you guys for your insight. And Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you. With that, Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Berman, in reading your testimony, I'm curious about this procurement roundtable that you are chair of. It was chartered in 1984. What does the procurement roundtable do?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question. Elmer Stotts actually was the first chairman of the procurement roundtable and chairman for many years, and one of the founders of the organization. We're a group that's limited to 50 people. Virtually all of us have had senior level positions in the federal government. We are now serving pro bono. We're all in the private sector at this point. And our goal is to try to help improve the acquisition process. We have meetings and talk to senior leadership and agencies and try to provide help and expertise to them. We provide an award to a young acquisition professional to recognize them and recognize their work and to try to promote good acquisition processes.
In the ending part of your testimony, you give a kind of a frightening percentage, and this is when then Defense Secretary William Perry actually did this major study, and he said DOD paid a cost premium of 18% as a result of the regulatory constraints, and I assume that was sometime in 1994.
It was.
So today, yeah. So today,
heavy document.
17 plus years later, I mean, what do you think that cost premium is that DOD? And I assume that's 18% above.
It is.
So what is that cost premium?
And again, nobody's really done that kind of a detailed analysis. There's been lots of reviews about regulations and the impact of regulations, but a lot of the issues are the kinds of things that you've been hearing from the committee, anecdotal concerns about how it makes it more difficult for somebody to do something. This was an effort to try to put a rigorous evaluation scheme together. They had 10 companies that were looked at in depth. There was something like 1,000 people interviewed, and they looked at cost drivers and what were the differences. And frequently they had companies that were doing both government work and private sector work like Motorola at the time, and you could then see what was the cost differential, and that was the value-added cost excluding materials. You know, I would bet, even given all of the kinds of concerns that we've had to try to improve things, just given Joel's comments about the growth of regulation and how people continually see ways to address these problems through more regulations, I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing a similar number, even when that was put in place back then, and we had the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, or FASA, to try to address many of these kinds of issues.
So Dr. Berman, you sit on a special roundtable of 50 people with exemplary experience, and you've been offering free advice to government, basically, and we are not doing any better than what we know we were doing in 1994. And I think Mr. Johnson made a point about, you know, I think what he was trying to say is that maybe there's just a percentage of people who are going to do bad things, and maybe we should calculate that in instead of over-regulating and instead of over-policing and over-regulating. Maybe we should just have it like a loss leader in inventory that some companies do and say, we lose that much, it's within the margin. I mean, nobody wants to accept that, but is that something that all of you experts, 50 of you, have you ever thought of that? The cost of monitoring, the cost of doing this. You know, we have DCAA, we have all these people who do almost pre-application processing. Is that a consideration that maybe we should just,
I think one of the views are to see if for particularly lower cost items, of which there are many, and if you look under a simplified acquisition threshold of $150,000, there are ways which you could try to make the process work more smoothly and simply. The issue becomes, even if it is only a couple of things, you know, we've all seen what happens when somebody does something that's a bad thing or a silly thing, the muffin business, all of a sudden that tars everybody who's doing the job with that kind of a complaint. And so it's awfully hard to do that and be willing to sit back and accept that, because it then becomes a reflection of how the government does its business. And none of us like to be accused of doing bad things.
Whatever happened to debarment? I mean, don't we have any kind of teeth with that? I mean, what happened to the good old days when people were afraid of being debarred and the shame that went with that? That has no value today?
And there has been a serious effort to do that, and I think many of the companies have in fact been suspended over time because of these kinds of issues, but debarment was meant to be a tool to protect the government from bad actors, and agencies use that, some more than others. I think in many respects defense probably is more effective in using this tool than many of the civilian agencies. So it's certainly not ignored, and agencies have been focusing on it, but you still are faced with the issue of if somebody does something bad, that is the Washington Post story.
And it's hard. I mean, one of the problems with debarment is you're dealing with somebody that's too big to fail. Just as it's too big, you can't debar Lockheed Martin because some guy makes a mistake somewhere in one of the subsidiaries. You have to be able to reach down and nail that particular. I remember Norm Augustine once in one of our very many scandals maybe 20 years ago saying, you know, I have 120,000 employees. Show me a town in the United States of 120,000 that doesn't have a jail. He says, somewhere out there, someone's doing something wrong at any given time. But you know, we do our best to make that not happen. But you got to find a way to reach out and debar or do whatever you're going to do that's of an appropriate scale. Not when you have huge companies, you simply can't debar any of these large companies. You've got to find measures that sort of fit the crime. And I think that's one of the problems that in some of these cases the government doesn't know what to do because it doesn't know what the mechanism is to get at that guy over there.
Mr. Chair, my time is up, but I did want to say too big to fail is not really a nice word around here anymore. Thank you, Mr.
I chose
Chair.
it advisedly.
Again, talked about a lot of things that we've heard before about government not talking to business. How much of that is driven by the regulations, and how much of that is driven by the culture of I'm not talking to them because I don't want to get in trouble? Is it? I mean, I'm sure they because of the regulations they're doing that. But I mean, how much of it is perceived and how much of it is reality? That is, I mean, can you quantify that at all?
It's hard to say. Clearly, when you've got an actual procurement on the street, when a procurement is out, then that changes the picture, because there you do have to be particularly careful about not giving somebody an unfair advantage. So that changes the equation. But prior to that procurement coming out on the street, there should be many opportunities to have these kinds of conversations. So sometimes it's workload, don't have the time. Sometimes it's perhaps people aren't really seeing in the long run what the benefits are of doing it, so it becomes a burden. Again, it becomes a cultural issue more than a regulatory issue when you're dealing with those kinds of problems, right, Mr. Chairman.
And that's occurring with the large primes as well as the small guys.
Well, what I mean, again, this is your one-size-fits-all problem, and that it's one thing when you're dealing with a large procurement. You've got 3 or 4 big guys competing for it. Yeah, there's all kinds of rules and regs that should be there, that no one should be given an advantage. And you know, they have the overhead to deal with what a procurement requires, and DOD has the overhead to deal with what the procurement requires. It's when you get down to the small guys where you're talking $100,000 or $500,000, then trying to run it the way you would run a large procurement may simply not be in the cards.
Right.
I mean, particularly if you're dealing with someone that's got a unique something, that's the whole reason you're wanting to reach out to him, is we think he's got a unique innovation. Then how do you deal with that, you know, that entity in a way that doesn't get you all caught up in acquisition regulations? Because there isn't another one out there right now, and all I want is a little bit of seed money to go do something and see what happens.
Right. And you mentioned about Congress, and I think we've done some of this, try to go in and change the regs, but it seems every time we change regs, we just pile more on top and make it more and more difficult. And so trying to, over the past 6 months, listening, hearing these things, you try to think, how do you go and change the culture over there? How do you mentioned that small businesses don't have contracting or even the accounting department to be able to deal with DOD. Nobody's really doing a lot of cost-benefit analysis on some of this technology, and you talked about intermediaries being able to reach out to the small guys to help them. So as I'm thinking through this, how do you? And Ms. Hanabusa talked about being debarred, and that brings up what I think to myself. Well, you've got different segments of different professions out there, different industries that self-regulate. The lawyers debar themselves. Accountants throw themselves, and they debar them, or whatever they call it, debarring an accountant. We've got an agency, a self-funding agency, FINRA, that regulates a lot of the securities and exchange industry. So is it possible to change the culture over there, or do we have to do something dramatic and maybe pull it out and let the industry self-regulate itself, especially when you're dealing with these smaller and medium-sized companies? Is that something that even in your mind, is it in the realm of possibility, or is I'm out of my mind even thinking that?
No, but I think one of the things that is done in the acquisition world is one company can complain about the other company when the other company has done something that they perceive to be incorrect or improper, or the government has done something through the protest process.
Right.
So in some respects, there's a way to redress these kinds of problems by protesting to the GAO and or the Court of Claims, or going back to the agency to complain that the process hasn't worked right or they've been unfairly treated. So you do have a mechanism that the industry more or less works itself that then still comes back to the government. But again, then you've got a regulatory process for the government to try to deal with
You
that.
say there is a regulatory, because that didn't happen on our tanker program.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I mean,
where does that occur out
it
there?
can become a very complicated process, but I mean, that one of the reasons for having a protest system in place is to try to allow firms an opportunity to go to somebody to complain.
Does that happen? You said that happens out there?
And it does
Within the
happen out
DOD
there.
or outside the?
I think the government-wide numbers, I mean, they're not huge. I think the government-wide numbers in terms of protests for the GAO is around 4,000 something. There's about 70 cases before the Court of Claims. A significant number of those, though, get turned around one way or another. The suspension rate isn't that high, but agencies do make some changes. So it's one means to try to offer a way other than the regulations themselves to try to make sure the process works fairly.
All right. Mr. Johnson?
Again, it's one thing to have, you mentioned the tanker program, I mean, one of the all-time largest acquisitions in history, as opposed to some little guy that you wanted to do $100,000 worth of business or $500,000. Right. And there, to pick up on Congresswoman Hannah-Buss's comment, I mean, you know, the price of perfection is very high. It's a lot cheaper to have 99% perfection, and it's even cheaper to have 95% perfection. And then one of the questions is sort of, what is it, you know, what is the pain tolerance level or the political tolerance level that one can put up with? I remember, and you know, this town is pretty awful for that. I remember in Desert Storm when, with all due deference to someone from GAO who may be in here, or if the only thing you'd ever read about Army equipment was in GAO reports and some other press reports, you would have been astonished to note that the M1A1s ran, that Bradleys ran, the A10s ran, all this stuff worked. Amazing, in really miserable, rotten conditions. But you know, during the time you're fielding this stuff, bad things happen until you put something in the hands of 21-year-olds. You really don't know what you got, no matter what you do at Aberdeen. And so you have to have some risk tolerance. And it seems to me the risk tolerance should go up the smaller the program is. And somebody's always going to find out that, you know, somebody's Uncle Todd got the $100,000 program from somebody who was in DOD. Well, okay, fine, it's going to happen. But 99% of the time, the guys are going to try to do the best job they can, and they may find some real nuggets out there if they have the flexibility to take a little risk. Some of them aren't going to pan out. Some of the, but again, how do you? What we're talking about, if you're looking for innovation in the small guys, how do you take risks? How do you?
Well, that's what the idea of you don't take it out of the DOD. Not the large contracts, but these smaller guys. Let it, like FINRA, it's for 70 years they've self-regulated, and the industry pays in. They go to these people at FINRA. They do protests. They regulate them. They tell them things that they can do, can't do, and it just seems to me I can't imagine we're ever going to change the culture over there unless we do something dramatic, because there's some reporter sitting out at the Washington Post looking to get somebody so they can write a story on, you know, Uncle Todd getting that contract. So again, back to my original, am I completely out of my mind even to think that there's something out there that exists today, a model for how we can, again, maybe it's just DCAA, or maybe it's you know, regulating small contracts.
Again, Mr. Chairman, there is there's something called the Defense Industries Initiative. I don't know if the committee is familiar with that operation, but it's something that one of the former procurement administrators, Angela Stiles, is now the chief person working with. But this was an effort by the industry, and this is largely large businesses in the industry, that has a very robust system for identifying what you can and can't do and trying to get the word out and providing training and that sort of thing, as a way, again, to try to ensure that their staff are doing things appropriately. And this is not something that's done or forced by the government. It's something that's, again, a self-regulated effort.
What is it called? The Defense Industry?
The Defense Industries Initiative. And that may be something the committee might want to look at. Again, the problem is when you have small businesses. I mean, small businesses sometimes they don't even know who to talk to in the government. I mean, just the basic question of, you know, you don't talk to a contracting officer. They're not going to know what the program is that you're going to try to deal with. You need to talk to the program official. Well, that's very elementary information, but if you're not doing business with the government, how do you know this? So you need somebody to help you to know these kinds of things.
You know, I'm way over my time, but I wanted to ask you another question about before you decide you're going to do something with DOT, maybe decide if you want to commercialize it. You know, how difficult. Some things I know are going to be simple, but in your experience, how difficult is that to look at something and say, is it pretty straightforward? You can look at something. We need thousands of this, so we need to have them produced by the millions to be able to drive down the cost. Is it in most cases it's going to be smaller projects, or are there things that are going to be larger?
I guess it will depend. I mean,
Right.
it certainly, if you can commercialize something, you're bound to drive the price way down. I mean, if you can
Right.
produce, if you go back 30 years, if I remember correctly, the military was 85, 90% of all microchips, and today they're about 1%, 2%. I mean, the commercial world drives electronics. So if it's something that has commercial applicability, that's what you want, as long as it's not. You have to weigh the probability that, okay, if it's commercialized, then all the bad guys can go buy it off the shelf too. They all have cell phones and they use garage door openers for IEDs, and that's, you're stuck with that, and you have to make that call. But by and large, if you can commercialize, but the other thing, there's going to be very unique stuff that only the DOD would be interested in. That's going to be high unit cost.
Right. So do a cost-benefit analysis on that. Say, is it worth us commercializing and letting bad guys?
And the trouble is, sometimes you don't know until so Steve Jobs invents things that nobody knew they needed, and so that's one of the hard parts in electronics. Is
right.
Again, you don't know what you don't know. But getting back to your point, maybe, and I'll probably have someone in the audience that's going to tell me this is already the case, and what can I say? But you may need particular offices in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy where you have some guys that just do this. That's their thing, is going and looking.
Right.
And they're familiar with the top technologies you guys are interested in, and they are empowered to make some decisions, and they're told, go take some risks. And if you pan out 1 out of 10 times, you're going to make colonel. As opposed to.
And I think the system does, in fact, react at times to meeting needs and helping agencies meet needs. There was a major transformation in the late 80s, early 90s to shift to a best value procurement process, evaluation process, and essentially one of the reasons for going down that path was you had all these IT companies who weren't interested in doing business with the government, and they weren't interested in somebody saying the requirements and this is how you're going to do the job. So the only way that the government could get them to come in was to say, okay, we'll evaluate you, this is a solution we want, you show us how to get there, and we'll have to measure apples and oranges and come up with the best result for the government. So, I mean, the system does adapt, it seems to me, when you have these kinds of major needs. Again, you have to have somebody say, yeah, this is what we want to do, and we'll take the risk of going to best value, and we'll take the risk of actually paying more for somebody than the low price offer, because it's good for the government to do that. So, I mean, there are certain things that are a benefit in how the government does its business as well.
So it's almost, when you mentioned there was a skunk works for procurement. Instead of development, let's go out there and
figure it out. 3 or 4 of them in the service, wherever you want to put them.
Right.
Yes, and DOD has used those kinds of techniques.
So think small and but think radical and be unleashed a bit.
Right. Does anybody else have Mr. Larson?
Mr. Johnson, back to ITAR. Do you have any specific examples? In fact, I think you do maybe have a couple of examples for the panel to consider about the impact ITAR has had on U.S. companies, maybe with regards to Europe, losing business to European companies?
I mean, when you read in the paper that, reading Defense News this week, Northrop Grumman is developing an ITAR-free DIRCM in Europe. Northrop Grumman, so even U.S. companies are inventing ITAR-free products overseas to avoid our system. This doesn't help our industrial base any. It helps the large companies, and more power to them. I mean, Lockheed Martin is doing an ITAR-free, if I remember correctly, it's a fire control system for a Canadian frigate, and they're going to do all the development offshore, so that they're not constrained. They don't have to go through what they have to go through. As you all know, I mean, Eleni advertises ITAR-free satellites. I mean, they're U.S. satellite, and it's the component guys that really get nailed on this. It's not the end item. I mean, in the satellite issue, Lockheed or Boeing can get a license to sell a satellite to pretty much anybody, as long as they don't launch it on a Chinese launcher. But when you're in Europe and you're buying in bulk, so you're going to make a standard satellite, and you're going to have minimum of 10 buses, the basic satellite. I want to be able to buy the same thing for all 10 for economies of scale. Now, one of those may turn out to have a Chinese buyer, or one of those may turn out to go out and be launched on a Chinese rocket. I can't pull one American component out and have to requalify my satellite. So the best thing I can do is not have any American content in my satellite, because they're all ITAR controlled, as you know, thanks to the law that was passed about 10 years ago. And so it's the component makers, it's the guys that make thrusters, it's the guys that make actuators, it's the guys that make stuff that goes on a satellite bus that now have lost that entire market. And of course, the Europeans in turn can sell back to Boeing and Lockheed Martin, because they don't have any constraints on selling into our market. So it's those kinds of things that, that's part of what the administration is trying to deal with by moving stuff over to the export control is, where you at least have de minimis. If it only has less than 10% American content, we don't try to control it. There is no de minimis when you are an ITAR product. If there's one American-made screw on an end item made in the UK or in France, they have to come back and say, "Mother, may I," to the State Department to sell it to anybody, including, Belgium or the Netherlands. They still have to come back and say, "Mother, may I." So you have a major disincentive to include American components. And as I say, the primary thing that works against are the component makers.
Who tend to be smaller businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, suppliers.
Mm-hmm. The end item makers, the airframers, the tank makers, okay, fine, they're going to have to get a license to sell a tank to anybody. But it's the little guys who are selling to people who don't at the time know who they're going to sell to. We would call in the aerospace industry whitetails. That is, you're building on spec. In the case of satellites, you do build on spec. Or you buy on spec in terms of, I'm going to buy 10 ship sets of this, and I know who the first 5 are going to. I don't know who the last 5 are going to.
Yeah.
And I just say in passing, it's more than you ever wanted to know. I mean, there's a couple of bills kicking around now that, in order to get co-sponsors, not only did they keep the China exclusion, they've added an exclusion for terrorist supporting nations. Well, that's all. Well, it sounds good, but that now means you couldn't sell a satellite to Arabsat or to Intelsat or to AsiaSat, because they all have, Syria or Iran have little bits and pieces. They never see these satellites. They're up there. They're delivered on orbit. But if you spread that tentacle around without being really sure what you're doing, now you're suddenly knocking our guys off of even more things that you really didn't intend to, but it looked good. And again, that's part of the problem on export controls. Things that look good aren't necessarily very good, but when you start to see the unintended consequences of what you've accomplished.
Okay. Dr. Berman, on the federal workforce in your testimony, page 3, and you mentioned it in your oral about the amount of dollars that we've seen an increase in contract obligations of 122%, but staffing is about 20%. I don't think you're making the argument that staffing should be 122%.
No, I'm not.
It should be 1 for 1, but
definitely not.
And I'm not sure you're arguing for a formula. However, can you enlighten us a little bit more about what what you mean for the federal acquisition workforce?
Well, one of the issues that results from that is, and I was a member of this SARA panel that was set up by Congress as well. Our report was produced in 2007 to look at services contracting, and we were looking at how do you do services contracting more effectively. And it turns out that there is the workforce was spending all of its time trying to get to award, doing proposals, getting the solicitations out. And so you end up with an issue where there's no time to do the monitoring, the contract management, the contract administration. So you end up with a system where, because people want to get those solicitations out, but you don't have enough people looking at the backside of the process, see are you getting what you need, are they doing it well, that kind of thing. I think it's those sorts of issues that come to play here when you put so much pressure on people to do the front end of the process and don't think as much or worry as much or pay as much attention to the back end of the process. And that's a common complaint I find across the government. And so having more resources to be able to do that, I think, would be a real benefit.
Okay. I see.
Or needing less resources up front. I mean,
either way, making it easier to do the front end, less complicated.
So you can spend some time on the back.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate your testimony. It was excellent. And hopefully, if we have any further questions, we can ask you in writing. So again, thank you all very much, and the hearing is adjourned.